and in this video, I'll be casting an awesome solid bronze dual-threaded bolt by using the Lost PLA method. In a recent video, I showed how I made this two-way bolt using a fairly cheap and easy method. The bolt turned out really nice looking, but the method I used didn't yield the best results, and honestly this doesn't look much like a bolt, does it? I mean, what kind of bolt doesn't have something to grab onto? So I looked around and I found a different model that actually looks like a bolt. Before I get too carried away, you should know that this is not my original design. The first guy to make one of these dual-threaded bolts is named Oleg Pevtsov. He made a great video showing how he machined his. You can find a link to that video in the description. To start making a bronze bolt, first I had to 3D print some models in a plastic called PLA. PLA is great for this casting process because of its relatively low melting point, and some normal PLA filaments can be burned away without leaving any ash behind. I use Overture Black, and I can tell you from experience that it burns away very cleanly. These models were printed on my 2Auto Pyramid 3D printer. 2Auto sent me this printer to use in my videos, and I've been very impressed with the print quality. If you're interested in possibly purchasing one for yourself, you can find a link below. Once everything was done printing and I finally stopped playing with the models, I started attaching the parts needed to turn them from plastic to metal. This big funnel-shaped thing is a sprue-feeder combination. It'll act as a funnel, helping me to pour in the metal, and it'll also feed the casting as the molten metal solidifies and shrinks. The nuts will be cast from the bottom to the top. Metal will flow down through the center sprue and rise up through each nut and out the vents. Each sprue was printed with a threaded hole so that I could screw in a bolt to use as a handle. This stuff is called suspended slurry. It's essentially a liquid ceramic that is used to create strong ceramic shell molds for metal casting. I carefully dipped the models into the slurry, doing my best to avoid trapping air bubbles on the surface of the models. My goal was to slowly build up thick shells by coating the models with slurry about 9 times. The first few coats are the most important, as this is where the fine detail is captured. After the first 2 coats, I sprinkled each subsequent coat with silica sand and allowed it to dry before adding another. After the 4th coat, I wrapped the shells with very thin steel wire. This acts like rebar, and it's a crucial step in preventing the shell from cracking during the burnout. I also experimented with sprinkling some fiberglass onto the shells for added strength. I let the shells fully dry for a few days and then placed them in my kiln to burn away the plastic and turn the shells into ceramic. I actually made 2 bolt molds because I wanted one to be cast in aluminum and one to be cast in bronze. At this point, I hadn't even turned on the kiln yet. This is showing the ambient temperature outside. I hardly even need a kiln when it's this hot out. I turned on the kiln and brought up the temperature very slowly, to about 500 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the temperature at which PLA starts to melt out of the shells. At this point, I was able to remove the vast majority of the plastic instead of just burning it away. Then I cranked up the temperature to around 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. This vitrified the shells, turning them into a ceramic that can withstand the temperature of molten metal. The next day, I inspected the shells, and I was happy to see that none of them had cracked substantially. I don't know if the fiberglass helped or not, but I can confidently say that if I hadn't wrapped them with wire, the shells would have cracked. With the shells ready to be filled with metal, it was time to melt some bronze and aluminum. Here's everything that I melted down: copper and tin on the left, and scrap bronze and tin on the right. As for the aluminum, I just melted down some pieces that I had left over from previous projects. The bronze for these castings consists of roughly 90% copper and 10% tin. The tin I'm using is actually lead-free pewter, which consists of about 95% tin and 5% antimony. I melted the pewter into an ingot that I could easily add to the molten copper when the time came. Before the shells could be filled with metal, they needed to be preheated to about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, so I stuck them back into the kiln for a little while. Once the shells were at the right temperature and the metal was ready to be poured, I removed the shells from the kiln one at a time and poured in the metal. Each shell is sitting inside an old crucible filled with warm sand, which keeps them stable during the pour. I let the shells cool down for a few hours and then started breaking them open. Breaking open these shells is like opening presents. It's always exciting, and you really hope you're not disappointed. Sometimes casting using ceramic shell feels like two projects. One project is casting, and the other is removing the shell. Removing the shell can be really difficult, especially if there's a lot of small details like with these. Fortunately, I have a sandblaster, which made the job a lot easier, but it still took about an hour and a half to remove all of it. These castings turned out great. I'm blown away by the detail the shell captured. These parts look like they were 3D printed in metal. I used a hacksaw to remove the sprues and excess metal, and then cleaned up some of the threads with a file. Then using my large disc sander, I carefully smoothed out the areas where the parts were removed from their sprues. This scene is for my wife. It drives her crazy when I use her Pyrex for my projects. To finish up, I used a wire brush to clean up the threads, and then polished everything with a die grinder, and these dual-threaded bolts were finally done. I absolutely love how these turned out. The detail is incredible, and everything works just as I had hoped it would. The more I play with these, the smoother the threads become. I know some people will say that the visible layer lines are ugly and should be addressed, but personally, I don't mind them. Layer lines are part of the process, and I think in this case, they just add to the coolness of these castings. If you enjoy watching these videos and you want to help me continue to make them, you can do so by checking out some of the Amazon affiliate links below. If you visit Amazon by clicking on one of my links and you end up purchasing something, I'll receive a small commission for that sale. As always, I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. Tell me what you think in the comments and subscribe for future projects. Thanks for watching.